IBM about to hedge its entire quantum future by buying a lab that runs on completely different physics than its own? That's the question hanging over today's biggest story. IBM signing a deal for HRL Laboratories, the Boeing and GM-owned research shop, and suddenly running two totally different qubit technologies side by side. Before we get there, in the headlines, 9 of the biggest names in Bitcoin, think BlackRock, Coinbase, Fidelity, just banded together with $15 million to quantum-proof the network, and the UK's quantum strategy just lost its home government department overnight. Welcome back to Quickly Quantum, your daily brief on the quantum frontier. It's Friday, July 24th, 2026. Let's get into it. Now, first up, money talks, and in Bitcoin security, it's now talking in the tens of millions. 9 of the largest institutional names in crypto, BlackRock, Coinbase, Strategy, Fidelity Digital Assets, Galaxy, Block, Blockstream, Anchorage Digital, and ARK Invest, have formed the Bitcoin Security Consortium, pledging $15 million over 3 years for long-term network security research, including preparing Bitcoin's cryptography for a future quantum computer that could break it. Quick refresher. Earlier this week, Galaxy alone put up $5 million for a similar push, and that's now folded into this bigger, coordinated effort. Here's the catch. The consortium hasn't said whether Galaxy's $5 million counts toward the new 15, or whether it's genuinely $15 million in new money. And not everyone agrees on urgency. Blockstream founder Adam Back has called the quantum threat decades away, while others in the space think a capable machine could show up within just a handful of years. Either way, when BlackRock and Coinbase are writing checks against a threat that doesn't exist yet, that tells you something about how seriously Wall Street takes the someday math. Now, sticking with IBM for a second before we get to the big HRL news, a smaller software update worth a mention. IBM has added a new error suppression tool called Orbit, built by a company called Quantum Elements, into its Qiskit functions catalog, which is IBM's marketplace of plug-in tools for its quantum software. Orbit uses dynamical decoupling, a technique that pulses tiny corrections into qubits to keep noise from creeping in mid-calculation. IBM says it roughly doubles the number of qubits you can use for a successful quantum Fourier transform, a core building block for lots of quantum algorithms, before errors wreck the result. This isn't a hardware breakthrough, it's tooling. One more entry in a growing marketplace of third-party fixes IBM is stitching into Qiskit to close the gap between what the hardware can technically do and what you can actually trust the answer to be. Worth watching whether these gains hold up outside curated benchmark circuits. Now here's one that should worry anyone who cares about government follow-through. New UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham abolished the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology on July 21st, folding it into a renamed Business Ministry, the Department for Business, Innovation, Science, and Trade. The announcement making that change never mentioned quantum at all, and there's real money riding on someone orny this file. The UK committed £2 billion to quantum back in March, including £1 billion specifically to buy quantum computers through a program called Procure, with the first contracts due in October. The good news, the delivery bodies actually spending that money sit inside a separate research funding agency, UK Research and Innovation, so they're mostly insulated. The bad news, the UK's Office for Quantum, the policy coordinating body, sat directly inside DCIT, the department that just stopped existing. To be clear, no funding has been cut. This is a structural risk story, not a budget story. But bureaucratic limbo has killed plenty of good policy before, and October's Procure contracts are now this new department's first real test. Now, over in the US, MIT has landed funding under the White House's Genesis mission, a national push for what's being called AI for Science, backed by more than $5 billion and spanning over 15 federal agencies. It was launched by executive order back in November of last year, run as a whole-of-government effort out of the White House. MIT's projects weren't broken down publicly with specific quantum dollar figures. The reporting doesn't give us that level of detail, but their selection tells you something bigger. Quantum-adjacent university research is increasingly getting swept into this much larger AI for Science funding wave, rather than funded as its own separate line item. Worth watching whether that's good news for quantum researchers riding the AI funding wave, or a sign that quantum on its own isn't pulling enough political weight to get its own dedicated pot anymore. Now, for something that's less breaking news and more a genuinely good argument worth hearing. A thread on X this week from the account @CarbonyXXX summarized comments from quantum theorist Scott Aronson, taking aim at both sides of the quantum hype war at once. On one side, you've got the crowd claiming quantum computers will transform everything within 5 years. On the other, a backlash crowd calling the whole field basically a hoax. Aronson's argument, as relayed in the thread: they're both wrong, and for the same reason. They're arguing about hype and marketing instead of the actual physics. The real source of quantum speedup, per that thread, isn't the vague, brute force parallelism people imagine when they hear qubit. It's amplitude interference, the way quantum states can cancel out wrong answers and reinforce right ones. Worth flagging, this is a second-hand thread quoting Aronson rather than his own original post, so treat the exact wording with a little caution. But the framing is one this show keeps circling back to. The hype and the backlash are both simplifications, and the real story is narrower, weirder, and more technical than either camp wants it to be. And last in the headlines, the internet's oldest quantum argument got revived this week. A thread from @0xsalty on X dug back up Google's quantum supremacy demo, the one where Google's processor reportedly finished a calculation in about 5 minutes that would supposedly take a classical supercomputer something like 10 septillion years. The thread's critique? So what? Beating classical computers on a contrived benchmark, built specifically to be hard for classical hardware and useless for anything else, proves nothing about solving a real-world problem. This isn't new. Critics like Gil Kalai have made versions of this argument for years, but it's a useful reminder every time a supremacy headline resurfaces. A demo that's brilliant hardware engineering and a demo that's practically useful are two very different claims, and the industry has a habit of blurring them. Now, speaking of companies making big bets on unproven hardware, let's get into today's main story. Our main story today. Call it the two-track bet. IBM just decided it doesn't want to put its entire quantum future on one qubit technology anymore. Here's what happened. IBM has signed a definitive agreement to acquire HRL Laboratories, a private research lab based near Malibu, California, jointly owned by Boeing and General Motors. Financial terms were not disclosed, so we don't actually know how big a check IBM just wrote. That's the first thing worth flagging. Boeing and GM aren't walking away either. Both companies will keep collaborating with IBM on quantum applications after the deal closes, expected by the end of the third quarter of this year, pending regulatory approval. This is well corroborated. Reuters, IBM's own newsroom, Yahoo Finance, and the Quantum Insider are all treating it as one of IBM's biggest quantum moves in years, not a routine tech acquisition. Now, why does a Boeing and GM-owned lab matter to a quantum computing company? Because HRL isn't just another chip maker. It's one of the few serious players in the world building silicon spin qubits. Quick refresher on what that means, because this is where the story gets technical fast. A qubit is the basic unit of quantum information, and there's more than one way to physically build one. IBM, like Google, has spent its entire quantum program betting on superconducting circuits, tiny loops of metal cooled to near absolute zero that behave quantum mechanically. HRL's approach is completely different. It traps the spin of a single electron inside silicon, the same base material that runs every laptop and phone chip on Earth. Different physics, different manufacturing challenges, different failure modes. One reason spin qubits get people excited, because they're built in silicon, the theory goes, you could eventually piggyback on decades of existing semiconductor manufacturing infrastructure, the same fabs that build ordinary computer chips, rather than needing entirely bespoke cryogenic hardware for every qubit. That's a scaling argument superconducting qubits don't have in quite the same way. And there's a competitive angle worth sitting with. Google's the other big superconducting player, so if spin qubits genuinely do scale better, IBM ends up racing its biggest rival on two completely different physical foundations, instead of the same track everyone in this race has been running since superconducting qubits became the field's default bet. This is a genuine strategic pivot, not a minor tweak. IBM has spent more than $10 billion over 5 years chasing a fault-tolerant quantum computer, one that corrects its own errors well enough to run large, reliable calculations, with a machine called Starling targeted for 2029 and a bigger system called Blue Jay targeted for 2033. Up until this deal, that entire roadmap ran through one technology. Now, IBM is buying its way into a second one in parallel. And HRL brings more than a different flavor of qubit. The lab's spin qubit research plugs into deep expertise in cryogenics, control electronics, qubit interconnection, and packaging. Basically, all the unglamorous plumbing you need to actually operate a quantum processor at scale, not just demonstrate one qubit working in a lab. So here's my read on this. IBM will tell you, and has told reporters, that this is additive, not a pivot away from superconducting, that superconducting remains its primary roadmap, and spin qubits are a hedge, not a replacement. That's the company line, and it's worth taking seriously, because Starling and Blue Jay, the two fault-tolerant systems IBM's been chasing, didn't change today. But look at what that hedge actually costs. IBM didn't license some spin qubit patents or start a small research partnership. It bought an entire private lab, jointly owned by two industrial giants, specifically for expertise it doesn't have in-house. Companies with total confidence in their existing roadmap don't usually go shopping for a second, structurally different qubit technology. Silicon spin qubits are a different physics problem entirely from superconducting circuits. That's not a rounding error in a research budget. And no purchase price was disclosed, which cuts both ways. On one hand, IBM clearly doesn't want anyone doing math on how much conviction is behind this. Vague numbers keep the story framed as a modest research acquisition instead of a strategic gamble. On the other hand, until we actually know the size of the check, we don't know if this is a small insurance policy or a real second bet at scale. I'd love to hand you a clean story about IBM boldly diversifying its way to fault tolerance, but without a dollar figure, that's the story IBM gets to write for us, and I'm not handing them the microphone for free. Here's what I'd actually watch. This deal is expected to close by the end of the third quarter, so within weeks, not years, HRL's roadmap starts actually merging with IBM's. The cryogenics, control electronics, packaging, all the unglamorous plumbing that decides whether any qubit technology scales past a lab demo. Does the HRL team get folded in as a genuine second track with its own budget and milestones, or does it quietly become a components supplier feeding IBM's existing plan? Those are two very different outcomes wearing the same press release. Zoom out, and this plugs into a bigger question the field's been circling for years. Is there going to be one winning qubit technology, the way silicon transistors eventually won out over vacuum tubes, or does building a genuinely fault-tolerant machine require running multiple parallel bets until one clearly pulls ahead? IBM just answered that question for itself, at least for now. If HRL's spin qubits scale better on some dimensions superconducting circuits struggle with, this stops looking like a hedge and starts looking prescient. If they don't, IBM just spent an undisclosed sum absorbing a talented team and some cryogenics know-how it folds into the roadmap it already had. Time for the hype check. I'm putting this one at a 6. The acquisition itself is real and well corroborated, and the strategic logic of not betting an entire fault tolerance program on one qubit modality makes genuine sense this early in the field. But no purchase price, no disclosed integration plan beyond additional insight into scaling, and a company insisting nothing about its primary roadmap has changed. That's a lot of unquantified upside riding on IBM's own framing of its own acquisition. Watch what happens with that HRL team by the end of Q3. That's the tell. These are threads we'll keep pulling on as IBM starts actually integrating HRL's team. That's the tell to watch by the end of Q3. If you're finding this useful, hit follow wherever you're listening so tomorrow's episode shows up automatically. It genuinely helps more people find the show. This has been Quickly Quantum, an AI-voiced podcast created and built by a real human using today's cutting-edge technology. Nothing you heard on this show is financial advice. I'm Brian Lampert, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Take care.